Okay, moving on to Great Britain. So you're going to see, just like in France, there's going to be an expanded sense of democracy in England. So, the idea uh, that all these different countries are kind of building empires in a lot of ways. We can connect this to the outbreak of World War I as all these countries continue to strengthen, especially corral behind the sense of nationalism. You are going to see that that leads to increased tension internationally. But anyway, getting more just into the general details about Britain, again, it's you can compare it to France because of that sense of nationalism. Also, Britain is experiencing a period of economic prosperity. It experiences the rise of a way of thinking, another ism called jingoism, um, which basically is really extreme nationalism, very aggressive foreign policy, patriotism beyond just, love of your country, but in a chauvinistic sense, like truly, my country is better than your country. You're going to see that in a lot of ways, jingoism lends itself to the age of imperialism when Britain is very aggressive in terms of its need to take control of many countries abroad, like China and various countries in Africa. So jingoism is an important idea to be familiar with. So in between 1850 and 1865, you're going to see a realignment of political parties in England. So they're going to change names. What was called the Tory Party is going to become the Conservative Party. And at this period, it's going to be led by Benjamin Disraeli, who was prime minister for a number of times in England. So the Conservative Party, what do they stand for? They are still defenders of the Church of England. They believe that there should be privileges specifically for the aristocrats. They also believe in a narrow franchise. So, in other words, they really don't want voting rights to be extended to the entire population. So that's kind of the bottom line of who the conservatives are. Then moving on to the what was the Whig Party, which now is going to be called the Liberal Party. Pretty easy to distinguish these two political parties. These new names, conservative and liberal, pretty easy to be able to tell them apart, I think. This is led by a man named William Gladstone, but also influenced by a number of different people, like another member of the House of Commons whose name was John Bright. He is going to make significant contributions to the development of the Liberal Party. He was an anti-corn law advocate. Remember the corn laws, which were typically benefiting the wealthy. He also leads a school of thought that's called the Manchester School, and basically this is a way. It's a way of thinking that supports laissez-faire economics, free trade, and the sense of libertarianism. In other words, really keeping the government out of people's private affairs. Um, so, so that's the general basis of the Liberal Party. And what you're going to see is that the competition between these two political parties is actually going to lead to an expansion of democracy across the board in England. Both parties are trying to sort of outdo one another. So let's start with the Conservative Party and look at its leadership under Benjamin Disraeli. Okay, so first off, Disraeli, who was again Prime Minister a number of times in England, was a huge supporter of really aggressive foreign policy. He wanted the British Empire to get bigger, and he was really nervous about the idea of domestic reforms, social reforms. Okay, so Disraeli is the kind of person who's really a big fan of imperialistic expansion, but he's nervous about granting additional rights to the working class, for example. But here's the thing, because the Conservative Party is competing so much against the Liberal Party, Disraeli is going to sort of reluctantly be drawn in to making some domestic reforms. Okay? And it's interesting also that Disraeli wrote a novel called Sybil in 1845, which actually showed a lot of sympathy for the working class. Um, it seems like as a politician, as a representative of the Conservative Party, he might have been more of an expansionist, imperialist, but in terms of practical politics, he actually did want to gain the support of the working class. And so uh, this also shows that he's influenced by certain people that are very much advocating the idea of expanded democracy. John Stuart Mill, who was a utilitarian, was a huge influencer on Disraeli's decision to for some of these reforms. So he wrote a book called On Liberty, which argued that it was necessary to increase democracy. And what this leads to is the Reform Bill of 1867. So this is seen as Disraeli's leap in the dark. In other words, it's not really a conservative tenet to expand voting rights for the working class, but Disraeli is doing it mainly because he wants to appeal to the working class and make sure the working class does not identify with the Liberal Party. So what does the Reform Bill do? Well, if you remember the Reform Bill of 1832, it expands upon that. Right? So one of the things that the Reform Bill of 1832 did was it kind of redistributed the different voting districts. The industrial cities, which were growing, were going to gain more seats, and some of the depopulated areas, like the agricultural areas, were going to lose seats. Those depopulated areas, remember, were known as rotten boroughs. Okay, so that redistribution is going to be really big. It's also going to expand the electorate. So now, basically, all men who are over 21 and live in urban areas were granted the right to vote. So this is going to double the number of people who can vote. So remember the Reform Bill of 1832, it only went from, it was like 6% of the population could vote, and then after the Reform Bill it was 12%. Now we're talking, basically half of, almost half of the entire population can vote now. Excuse me. It's doubling the amount of people who can vote, but it's not going to be universal suffrage, right? Rural people still can't vote, for example. And so what's Disraeli's motivation? Well, he's trying to broaden support for the Conservative Party and make it so that not just aristocrats and landowners are in favor of the Conservative Party. So, he may go against some organically conservative policies to get this done. The Liberal Party at this point is trying to introduce some welfare measures, and these are under a program called the People's Budget. All right, so it's going to try to tax the rich to pay for a lot of these welfare measures, but the conservatives try to block it, but then they fail to because the king actually decides to support these welfare measures. So see, that there are some inherent weaknesses in the conservative strengths. Another thing that's going to happen with this conservative government is they are going to be looking out for the working class in terms of improving sanitation. The government is going to kind of sponsor regulations to make sure that cities remain cleaner. So moving on to William Gladstone. So William Gladstone was seen as the most important liberal figure in 19th century England. Some of the principles that he supported. We're going to get into this in more detail in just a little bit, but he supports Irish home rule. In other words, he believes that the Irish should govern themselves. Up until this point, they were still part of Great Britain, and we're going to see pretty soon this Irish independence movement, which Gladstone supports. The reason why he wants them to have that, well, he wants the Irish to have home rule so long as they support the people's budget. We just mentioned that earlier. That was something that the Liberals pushed through and the Conservatives failed to block it. He also wants there to be free trade. He wants to extend democratic principles throughout England, so, further expanding the electorate, for example. But he's also very anti-imperialist. He's also opposed to the fact that with conservative influence, the Church of England is still very powerful. So you're going to see that he gets rid of, compulsory taxes to support the church. All right, so this basically advocates some more religious freedom. Something that the Chartists, hopefully you remember them from earlier in the 19th century, advocating universal suffrage. The Chartists wanted a secret ballot, right? Because, otherwise you could have influential people like your employer, for example, pressuring who you voted for. On Under Gladstone's leadership, you're going to have a secret ballot introduced under the Australian Ballot Act of 1872. Um, he's also going to be in favor, it's not written here, but it's in your notes, of civil service reform. So in other words, not just through crony. So under civil service reform, it's not just through cronyism that you get a position in the government. Now you're going to see that you have to take a competitive exam to work for the government. So it's more of a meritocracy. Um, Also, he's going to support the Reform Act of 1884, and this is going to further extend the Reform Act of 1867. All right, so now you're going to see that even adult males who live in rural areas, so agricultural workers, are also going to get the franchise. All right, so this is going to extend the vote to about 70% of the male population. So you might say, well, what's that other 30%? Under the Reform Act of 1884, there are still property qualifications to vote. So, people that are renting, for example, are still going to be prohibited from voting. So, again, you're going to see one of the major themes in England at this point is expanding democracy. Each political party is trying to do this in order to gain the favor of various political classes. You're also going to see that there's going to be an emergence of new political groups. And none of these actually emerge to become prominent political parties, but what they are going to do is push the major political parties for a further extension of democracy. So two of the important groups here, there's one called the Fabian Society. All right, so they're socialists and they get some other ideas from Marx, but they're far less extreme than Karl Marx. Remember that one of the things that Marx said was that revolution was inevitable in order to introduce socialism to a society. The Fabians actually don't believe that. The Fabians are very apprehensive about class conflict. So they believe the way to accomplish economic socialism is actually through gradual changes. So what the Fabians are going for actually is, they believe that with extended political democracy, so as more and more people are able to vote, this is going to sort of organically introduce economic socialism to a society. So again, they're really not, they're called revisionist Marxists because they take Marx's ideas but actually make them a lot more practical. And this is going to give the Fabians more clout and influence over the major political parties. You're also going to have an independent Labor Party emerge, and they are, in a way, kind of it's a group of mostly socialists who believe actually that both the Conservative and the Liberal Party really aren't looking out for the best interests of the population, of the general public. So, they favor their own independent third party, right, that advocates the rights for these workers. So again, even though neither the Fabians or the Independent Labor Party or also, other minor political parties, none of them actually become a major political party to compete against the Conservatives and the Liberals, they're still influencing them nonetheless. So in the early part of the 19th century, the Liberal Party is going to be responsible for some pretty aggressive social and economic programs. And the notable ones, Parliament Act of 1911. So before this act was passed out of the two houses of Parliament, the House of Lords was much more powerful. It did have the ability to kind of block legislation that the House of Commons was putting forth. So what the Parliament Act does is it eliminates these powers of the House of Lords and it makes the House of Commons the center of national power. All right, other things that it does is it pays Parliament members, so that means you don't have to be rich to be a member of Parliament, so that's a huge change. And it's also going to reduce the lifespan of Parliament, so it used to be in session for 7 years, and now it's 5 years. And you might ask why that is and why that's more democratic. Basically, that means that Parliament is subject to elections more frequently, so ultimately it's kind of reinstilling power in the hands of the people in that sense. All right, we'll pick up with the welfare state in just a moment.